talk, which is going to be held by Elly Koutamanis. It's going to be a talk on language coactivation in the simultaneous bilingual child's lexicon, a primed eye tracking study. Hello, Elly. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right now?
I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So the topic of my presentation concerns a very fundamental question in the research on the bilingual child's lexicon, namely whether the words from the two languages form two separate systems in the lexicon or one shared system with the words from both languages. And relatedly, whether during processing only words from one language are activated, so language selective access, or whether words from both languages are activated simultaneously, the language non-selective access. And these questions have been well studied in bilingual adults, but not so much in bilingual children. So, although there are many different models of the mental lexicon, or the bilingual mental lexicon, there are some shared aspects that many models have. So I will give you some examples in the form of a Greek-Dutch bilingual lexicon. So what many researchers agree on is that there is a shared semantic representation. So here we have one word where the semantic representation is indicated by the image of the skirt. And this is shared for the two languages. Then we have the two form representations, which are tagged for the language they belong to. We have in blue, we see the Greek word for skirt, fusta. And in orange, we have the Dutch word for skirt, rok. So these form representations are separate for the two languages, but sublexically, they share, or the words from the two languages share their phonology, leading to a more indirect relation between, for example, the Greek word roda and the Dutch word rok, which share part of their phonological representation in the ro sounds. As a consequence, we can find between language phonological priming between words like roda and rok. Between language priming, I mean both facilitatory and inhibitory spreading of activation between these lexical representations of the words from both languages. But of course, we can also find this within language between, for example, rots and rok, two Dutch words that share part of their phonology. And because of the shared semantic representation, you can find translation priming, for example, between fusta and rok, or between rots and vragos. And finally, on the semantic level, words are also connected to words that have similar meanings, but not identical meaning, for example, between a dress and skirt. So priming on all these levels has been found in bilingual adults, but in children, between language priming is really underexplored. And we cannot automatically assume that we find the same effects as we do in bilingual adults. So if we take a speaker from both populations, so most obviously they differ in their chronological age. This entails cognitive differences, where some studies have found that children process lexical information less efficiently, activating more words, leading to more competition and also more priming effects compared to adults. And secondly, these speakers typically differ in their age of onset, as most adult bilinguals that are being studied are L2 learners, whereas children acquire their two languages more or less simultaneously. And most research on simultaneous acquisition has focused on the syntactic development or morphosyntactic development. with most researchers agreeing on separate morphosyntactic systems, although they do allow for cross-linguistic influence. So these two differences in age and age of onset might lead us to expect either more priming in bilingual children compared to adults, or more separation in children. Luckily, we have some previous literature to go on. So if we assume a similar model of the bilingual lexicon in children, priming on different levels has been found. I have to say none of the studies are actually Greek-Dutch, but I'll stick to this example. So if we have the target word, the Dutch word rok, priming has been found on the phonological level, so that would be from rok to rok, as well as on the translation priming, so through the semantic level, and also semantic priming on the semantic level, also within language in bilingual children, and even in an indirect form, where a Greek word vragos could prime the Dutch word rok through its translation, which is rots in Dutch. So there's evidence that a word in one language can automatically activate its translation and thereby prime a word that is phonologically related to that translation. So although we have evidence of priming on these different levels, but there are some limitations, because all these studies generally concern toddlers of maximally 30 months old. So that's a limited group. And it also brings some other issues or limitations, better, where, well, in toddlers you can only compare so many numbers of conditions within one study, and there's also not that much background information available, and you cannot do many background tests in these young children. And as a consequence of this, there is some evidence for dominance effects in bilingual toddler priming, where priming from the dominant language is stronger. But not all studies have found this. So these results are still inconclusive. So because of these limitations, in the current study, we would like to address the question to what extent and at which levels of lexical representation there are between language priming effects and mediated priming effects, so these indirect priming, in older children. So we have looked at school-aged simultaneous Greek-Dutch bilingual children and compared different conditions and included different background measures. So the model that we test is the same model that we've seen before in the adults. And we expect to find, with rok as a target, we expect to find between language priming on both on the phonological level and on the conceptual level, so translation priming, as well as within language priming on phonological level and semantic priming. And finally, this mediated priming, so where the Greek word vragos can prime rots through its Dutch translation rok, but also in another direction, where a Dutch word, wiel, through its Greek translation can prime the Dutch target word. We tested it in a group of 26 Greek-Dutch bilinguals who were aged between almost 5 years old and 9 years old. They were all living in the Netherlands, and all of them had started learning both languages at least before age 4, but most of them from birth or within their first year of life. We also tested a group of Dutch monolinguals who were matched on age and socioeconomic status. Thank you. Thank you. Because we wanted to test the paradigm and also have a control group. We assessed their proficiency through vocabulary tests in Dutch and in Greek. And we also assessed their grammatical development through a sentence repetition task in both languages, as well as their working memory. And through a parental questionnaire, we assessed their exposure and use to both languages. The main task was prime picture selection with eye tracking, where a trial looked like this. The children were looking at a screen and heard the prime word, for example, fusta, which is the Greek word for skirt. And then 200 milliseconds later, 2 images appeared. And at the same time, they heard the target word, in this case, rok, the Dutch word for skirt. So the one image is the target image, and the other was a distractor that was unrelated, both on the phonological and on the semantic level. As soon as the images appeared, we measured their eye movements and eye tracking. These results are not yet analyzed, so I will present what we have right now, but that's just an exploration. But in addition, the children were required to press a button indicating the left or the right picture to choose which was the target. And we have these these reaction times we do have analyzed. The children were tested in 2 sessions. One Dutch to Dutch priming session where the background tests and the instruction, everything was in Dutch. But everything was in Dutch. And we used 28 different Dutch target words that were paired. They were each paired with 4 different Dutch prime words, forming these different conditions. So as a baseline, we always had an unrelated control prime, then a phonological prime, semantic prime, and phonological prime through translation. And then 1 to 3 weeks later, the bilingual children were tested again, this time in a Greek to Dutch priming session where everything was in Greek. The background test and instructions and prime words, but we did use the same 28 Dutch target words, this time again paired with a Greek unrelated prime.
3 minutes.
Are you sure? Sorry, Michal. I think I have until another 7 minutes, or no?
So sorry. Yes.
No problem, but just so that I don't skip anything unnecessarily. Thank you. So this time the words were paired with Greek prime, so an unrelated Greek prime, phonological related Greek prime, the translation prime, and the other form of phonological prime through translation, where the prime was a Greek word. We analyzed the reaction times in 3 separate analyses. Between language analysis with the translation and phonological priming, within language semantic and phonological priming, and then a separate analysis for mediated priming, so where we collapse the 2 forms of phonological priming through translation. We controlled for many different variables regarding the words that we used, things like trial number, age, working memory, and also proficiency, exposure, and use of both languages. And finally, as I mentioned, we are exploring the eye tracking data. So to start with the results from between language priming, here you can see the log reaction times for the bilingual children. And as you can see, compared to the gray reaction times in the control condition, the children responded faster in translation priming in red and in phonological priming in blue. So there's clear evidence for between language lexical priming. The eye tracking data the eye tracking plot that we have here shows the proportion of gaze towards the target image. And the black line is the control condition. What you can see is that the proportion of gaze towards the target was early on, it was lower in the phonological condition compared to the other conditions. So this indicates an early inhibition effect, probably. Later on, the lines converge more, and later in time, it might even suggest a facilitation effect in the phonological condition. But as I said, these are unanalyzed data. Moving on to within language priming, we first analyzed the monolingual control group, where we found that they responded faster in the semantic priming condition, in red again, but not in the phonological priming condition. In the bilinguals, again, there was priming going on in the semantic condition, But this only happened under certain circumstances, only in interaction with the proportion of Dutch exposure and the proportion of Dutch use. So there's something going on, but only under certain circumstances. And at the moment, we're still trying to understand exactly what these circumstances are. And I'm happy to address this in the discussion if there are questions about it. The eye tracking plots show the same patterns that we found in between language priming, so with early phonological inhibition and probably or possibly later facilitation. And finally, the mediated priming effects. So to remind you, this is from Vragos through Rots to Rok, and from Wiel in Dutch through Roda to Rok. So two forms of phonological priming through translation. And we found this in interaction with proportion of Dutch use. And this interaction looks like this, where the reaction times were not really affected by the children's proportion of Dutch use in the control condition. But when the children were being primed, it did matter how much Dutch they used themselves. And on the left-hand side, for the children who mostly spoke Greek, this is more, we see an inhibition effect, which is in line with what we know from the literature. So that part was expected. But for the children who mostly used Dutch, we saw a facilitation effect, which is a bit more unexpected compared to what we know from the literature. Thank you. Eye tracking plots, however, again suggest early inhibition effects in both forms of phonological priming through translation. So, sum up, how are these school-aged simultaneous bilingual children the same or different from what we know from bilingual adults? So start with a short recap of what we found. We have found between language priming on the phonological level and on the semantic or conceptual level through translation. And within language priming, we only found evidence for semantic priming and not for phonological priming. We did find evidence for both forms of phonological priming through translation. The eye tracking plots seem to suggest mostly phonological priming and mediated priming. So if these patterns are confirmed by analysis, this forms a nice addition to our reaction time results, as these concern other conditions more. And it might have the potential to show us more about the time course of this online processing by showing differences between early and late effects. But even just the reaction times, you have found priming in different forms, which clearly indicates co-activation of the lexical representations from words from both languages, or in other words, language non-selective access. And this is what we know from the adult literature as well. Although we had quite a large age range, from almost 5 to 9 years old, the priming effects that we found were not affected by age in any of the analyses or working memory. So this leads us to the next question: how does language non-selective access develop? Because we had these potential differences between children and adults. So what we know from the literature on simultaneous bilingual toddlers, so very young children and adults, we have evidence for these different forms of between language priming. So qualitatively, thank you. Qualitatively, there doesn't really seem to be a huge difference between the school-age children and the adults and the toddlers, in the sense that we have found effects on all these levels. But of course, we cannot underestimate the potential differences within the populations. This leads to the final issue: which factors predict the magnitude of priming? So in L2 adults, generally effects from the first language to the second language are larger than effects from the second language to the first language. So a dominance effect. And in some of the toddler literature, these types of effects were also found. In our current study, we found no interactions with proficiency, exposure, and use of both languages in between language priming conditions. But we did find these interactions in mediated and within language priming. So, to sum up, we have this study adds clear evidence for language non-selective access in simultaneous bilinguals, indicating the interconnectedness of lexical representation in the bilingual lexicon and the spreading of activation both within and between these languages. In our sample, it was not affected by age, and from what we know from the previous literature, it could very well be something that takes place in all ages. But both regarding things like age, executive functions, as well as individual differences in proficiency, exposure, and use, we will need much more research and especially many, many more participants. So on that note, I would like to thank NWO for your attention, of course, NWO for funding, our testers, our participants and their caregivers, and my colleagues from the 2-in-1 research project. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elly. Thank you for the interesting talk. We have a question we have some questions from the public. First one is coming from Marie and Mourant, who found your study very interesting and is asking how sensitive were children to small phonetic differences, like different realization of R in Greek and Dutch with regard to phonological priming in your data. Does maybe less facilitation when there are small phonetic differences?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So we try to keep the realizations of these phonemes as similar as possible by using the same bilingual speaker for both languages. But yeah, there were some, because there were some restrictions on the words that we could use. For example, they were all non-cognates. They had to be familiar to the children. We had to make some we had to be a bit more generous in some cases. So for example, the different realization of the R. However, there is some work, previous studies on whether we should focus on like phoneme representations or phonological representations. And that's not entirely clear as far as I know right now. In addition, we did compare also between the specific items, and there were no outliers there or huge differences between the specific items, so the phonological realization of the phonological overlap, for example. But yeah, this is something that we need to be careful about. Thank you.
Thank you for answering the question. Our next question is coming from Elizabeth, who's also thanking you for a great talk. She's asking whether any of your participants were learning a foreign language in primary school and whether this affected or might have affected the results.
Yeah, that's also a very good question, because all these participants lived in the Netherlands, and I think as in many other European countries, it's impossible to find pure monolingual speakers even in childhood, because well, English is quite prevalent in media, and some of the older children might have started with a little bit of English education at school as well, but this was never more than 1 hour a week. So no bilingual primary schools, for example. But we did, we did exclude participants who had more than 1 hour of foreign language instruction. This was also the case for the bilingual children, of course. And because of the nature of the stimuli there, we didn't really expect any influence from English, because we carefully matched the primes and target words, and where possible, we also avoided any potential unwanted influence from English. So I don't expect that it had a huge influence, but it is difficult to avoid this completely.
Thank you very much for answering this. Our next question is from Hai Long Lee, who's asking, she would like to know your opinion about the possible effect of script difference, as some languages differ a lot in their scripts. I suppose it can be also for a little bit older children then.
Yeah. So we, through the parental questionnaire, we have the information whether these children were able to read and write in both languages, because of course Greek and Dutch do differ on their script. Most of the children were not able to read very well in Greek. So because they were a bit, yes, maybe for some of the older children, this might play a role. So because what we know in adults that the script, the orthographic representation is also activated in priming. But in these children, actually, I said some of the older children, but that's not even entirely the case. Maybe some of the more proficient children would activate this knowledge, but it was not the case that the older children were more capable of reading and writing in Greek, for example. Yeah, so most of them didn't read and write very well in Greek, so that probably didn't affect the current results, but it is something that in adults we know that this can be the case. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you. I have maybe also a question myself. We had a question on the differences, the language differences between the two languages, and whether you incorporated thoughts on this into your design. In recent months and years, we are seeing more the influence of culture on how people perceive and learn their languages. It's really nice that you had a consistent group of people, but do you think there might be different effects in terms of how much emphasis is put in different cultural settings on learning the first or the second language, or both languages at once?
So you mean if this would be different for another language combination, for example?
Yeah, maybe do you think the language attitude, which is also brought by or transferred to the parents, can differ consistently across cultures?
Yeah, so that is definitely an interesting topic. Much of the research on bilingual children in the Netherlands are concerned, or an obvious group would be, for example, English, Dutch bilinguals, also child L2 learners. So that's one of the reasons that I wanted to explore this bit more unknown population. Because the language attitude towards English is very positive in the Netherlands, but towards some other languages, of course, not so much. And Greek is, I think, not a language that people have very strong opinions about. So in the remainder of the project, we are addressing multiple language combinations also to, this can also help us exploring whether that makes a difference or not. And generally, I think just from my experience in testing with this group, people were positive about being bilingual, and also did not receive very negative comments, but it was also not the main, it was not always a very huge topic in their lives. So, but yeah, we want to compare that in the future with different groups as well.